Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my third talk in the Science and Religion series. So this is the Kalam Cosmological Argument. My name is Dr. Christina Sweeney-Hillesheim. If this is your first video, thank you for attending. You are welcome to watch the other two first, but if not, I just want to do a brief introduction. I have a doctorate in chemistry and a master's in apologetics, and my focus is on scientific background for Christianity. Originally, I was an atheist and then became a Christian. So today's talk is going to be on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. So just to give you a brief history of this argument. So the argument was first originated kind of back in the time of the Hebrews and then Aristotle. So the Hebrews, or Christians, believed that God created the world out of nothing, whereas Aristotle believed that God isn't the creator of the universe, but that he simply imbues order into it. So God and the universe are both eternal, but God kind of created like the laws and like the mechanism that kind of controls or puts order into the universe. So this was a big debate between the Christians and Aristotle, because one believes that the universe was created by God, and one believed that God and the universe were eternal. So this was kind of a debate that was going on. Now, pardon me for some of the names. Hopefully I get them right. But John Philoponus, or Philoponus, I'm not sure, was a prominent Christian philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Egypt during the 14th century. And he argued that the universe had a beginning. And he's kind of the first one that kind of started really building up an argument that was able to be, used in this argument between Aristotle, or the secularists, and Christians. Now, during this time, Islam kind of started to take over North Africa, and this is where Muslim theologians started to pick up on this argument that John was kind of producing and sharing. And they also believed in creation. And so this argument became just highly developed within Islamic medieval theology and became very popular. Now, it didn't really get a lot of traction at first until a man named Al-Ghazali, which was a very famous Muslim proponent of this argument, kind of got behind it and started to kind of build out the argument a little bit deeper. Before, the argument didn't have a lot of the pieces to it and was kind of a loose argument, but he kind of built up the meat of the theory in the argument. And he lived from 1058 to 1111. Now, these arguments eventually got passed back into Latin-speaking Christendom. So at that time, the Muslims had conquered into Spain. And so the Muslim theologians that were kind of into this argument and were starting to think through it, started to kind of have some mediation with Jewish thinkers and started to talk back and forth with these Jewish thinkers about this argument. And so there was a little bit of debate and discussion about it. And so for them to really be able to discuss this argument in full, then the argument was translated into Latin so that they could have deeper discussions about it. So then this is when it kind of went from being originally kind of a Christian argument into a Muslim argument, and then kind of translated back and returned back into Christianity. Now, once it became translated back into Latin, then several other philosophers in Europe were able to kind of find out about this argument and then write about it and publish it. So Bonaventure, who was an Italian philosopher, started to write about it in the 13th century. John Locke, a British philosopher, wrote about it in the 17th century. And then Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, wrote about it in the 18th century. So now you can kind of see the development of this argument over time, but it is a rather historic argument. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what does kalam actually mean? So the meaning of the word kalam reflects kind of its Islamic origin. So that's why it's more of a Arabic word than maybe a Latin word. Here I have the Arabic word for you. So if you know how to read or speak Arabic, then you'll be able to see what that word is that's represented there. And this word means speech or doctrine. And it came to not only characterize this argument, but really to characterize the whole medieval movement of Islamic theology. So really, when someone would talk about Kalam, they weren't really talking about necessarily only this argument, but really a highly academic theology of the Middle Ages, which then later kind of evaporated and was just simply this argument. So what are the steps of the argument? So this is a logical argument. So we have three steps, or two premises and then the conclusion. So the first premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause, and I'll talk about each one of them. The second is that the universe began to exist, and then therefore the universe has a cause. So let's look at each one of these step by step. So kind of the first step or premise is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So metaphysically, it's metaphysically necessary that anything which begins to exist has to have a cause that brings it into beginning. So if it wasn't always existing, but it began, then something had to kind of create it to begin. So the way that we would think about this, things just don't pop into existence, uncaused, out of nothing. Even atheists, even though some atheists believe that we came from nothing. So for example, atheist Quentin Smith concluded that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. However, this concept is based on the concept of absolute nothingness, which intuitively, if we think about it, doesn't quite fit with what they're trying to say. If we're saying that we came from absolutely nothing, we haven't really seen that. So for example, if we have, say, example in magic, there's a magician and he's going to pull a rabbit out of a hat. Then the rabbit isn't coming out of nothing. There was a cause. There was something before. There's the magician and then there's the hat. So even if we're saying the rabbit came out of nothing, there was things before that caused it. And so if something has a beginning, then it could not have popped into being out of nothing, but must have had a cause that brings it into existence. So I'll give you another example of this. There's empirical evidence for the truth of this premise. So the principle is consistently confirmed and it's never been falsified. So what this means is we never see things coming into being uncaused out of nothing. So that's what it means by consistently confirmed. Like there's never been a time where something has just popped into being that was uncaused. So for example, we don't just have a horse popping into your living room. You're not living your every day, going to work, and while you're at work, you're like really worried. Oh no, a horse might just pop into my living room and cause chaos. Like we're not really expecting something to exist out of nothing, just to kind of have a cause, like begin without having a cause. So this premise is more plausible than deniable because of our evidence, or observational evidence has shown that we don't really see things kind of popping without having a cause, occurring without having a cause. Now, the previous lecture that I had, which was on the Big Bang, showed that scientists don't really have an explanation for what caused the Big Bang. So we're talking about this in relationship to the universe. And so when it comes to the universe, that explanation with the Big Bang, they have some options or proposals for what caused the Big Bang. However, everything that they propose either first must have a first cause itself. So something had to cause that, which then caused something else, which then caused the Big Bang. Or it only works in a theoretical world. So what that means is they're using theoretical math. So they're either using imaginary numbers instead of real numbers. And when you convert the real numbers into imaginary numbers, then it just doesn't work. The famous skeptic David Hume didn't deny this first premise. He actually wrote in 1754, "I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause." So this premise was not really disputed until the discovery of scientific confirmation for the beginning of the universe in the 20th century. So the first premise is only now being challenged because science has confirmed the second. So thus, if people do not like the conclusion that the universe had a beginning, then they have to either attack the first or the second premise. But now that science has provided more evidence for the second premise, that now they have to go and attack the first premise. So that's now why we're only actually starting to get some arguments in relation to this first premise. For until the 20th century, this first premise was pretty much accepted and was okay. So let's talk about that second premise. So that second premise says that the universe had a beginning. So it used to be a very controversial premise. This was the more hot topic premise out of the two. So ancient Greeks, like I said, Aristotle, believed that the material world is eternal, whereas Christians believed that the universe had a beginning due to biblical revelation. Now, secular science, before recently, back in the day, believed that the universe was eternal and static. Now, how do we talk about this premise? So, back in the day when they first established this argument, there was kind of two pathways to establishing it, either a mathematical or philosophical argument or a scientific argument. Now, the scientific argument is a newer, more contemporary argument, and that's with using the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory supports the fact that the universe has a beginning, but that's only more recent scientific evidence that has really supported this premise. So in the beginning of this, in the history, in the beginning of this argument, it was more of a mathematical or philosophical pathway that was used since science really hadn't caught up at that time. And if you would like to hear more about the Big Bang part of this argument, you can watch the previous lecture. So what does the mathematical or philosophical pathway say? So like I said, this was developed very early by the Christian and Muslim scholars. And they used mathematical reasoning to demonstrate that it's impossible to have an infinite past. So if the universe did not have a beginning, if it was always existing, eternal, then it would have an infinite past. And so what logic is saying is that absurdities, and I'll give you an example of these, but absurdities would result if you were to have an actually infinite number of things. And so why would we have an infinite number of things? So if we're talking about a past, if we had an infinite past, then that would involve an actually infinite number of events. And so then because we can't have that because of these absurdities, then the past simply can't be infinite. Now you might say, well, that's just a discussion. Where do we actually come to that conclusion? So let me give you an example of why we can't have an infinite past or an infinite number of things. So I want you to kind of think about marbles, okay? So I have an infinite number of marbles, and I want to give you some marbles, okay? So I have an infinite number of marbles, and first example is I'm going to give you all the marbles. So if I had an infinite and I give you all of them, now I don't have any, and you have an infinite number. So I had infinity, I gave you infinity, and I have 0 left. So in this case, infinity minus infinity is 0. Now let me give you a second scenario. I have infinity marbles, but I want to give you all the odd number. So 1, 3, 5, 7, etc., all the way to infinity. So if I have an infinity and I want to give you all the odd numbered marbles, but I have infinity, that means I'm also giving you infinity. So I have infinity, I give you an infinity number of marbles, which means you have infinity and I still have infinity. So even though I have an infinity and I gave you infinity, I still have infinity left because I have an infinity of even numbered marbles. Okay, stay with me. Number 3 example. So I want to give you all the marbles numbered 4 and higher. So I have an infinity number of marbles. So 1, 2, 3, all the way to infinity. And I want to give you 4 all the way to infinity. So I have infinity. I give you 4 all the way to infinity. So in essence, I'm giving you infinity. I'm going to have 3 left. Okay. So in each of these cases, we have subtracted the identical number from the identical number. So we're subtracting infinity minus infinity every single time. But when we do this math, we come up with non-identical results. So this notion of infinity ends up leading to contradictory results. This is why mathematicians are actually forbidden from doing subtraction and division in transfinite arithmetic, because this would lead to contradictions. So the idea of an actual infinity is just conceptual. We think of an infinity, it exists in our minds, but we can't really work with it from a mathematical standpoint. We have to work within certain rules. So mathematicians can deal with infinite quantities and infinite numbers in the conceptual realm. However, it's not very descriptive of what happens in the real world. So we can't really use it when we're trying to think of what would actually happen. So because we can't have an infinite number of events in the past, because then we get these absurdities and contradictions, then that means that the universe can't have an infinite number of events. So infinity, that sense, can't exist in that sense. So then that means that the universe has to have a beginning. Now there's another way that we can kind of think about why the universe can't have an infinite number of past events and must have a beginning. And this is the issue of the impossibility of traversing the infinite. So even if you could have an actual infinite number of things, how would we obtain them? So to obtain an actual infinite number of things, you couldn't form it by just adding one number after another. So I get this, I add this, I add this, I add this, I add this, because you can always add one more before you get to infinity. So how do we actually get to infinity? We can't do it by just simply adding things along. So if the past really were infinite, then that would mean that we've managed to traverse an infinite past to arrive at today, which isn't possible. So the way that you could kind of think about this, if you're trying to follow me, is look at my number scale here. Okay, so it would be as if someone had managed to count down all of the negative numbers and to arrive at 0 at the present moment. So if the past had an infinite number of events, you'd have to count all the way, all these events until you got to 0, which would be now. And that task is intuitively nonsense. It's not possible. So we can't have that accumulation of past events, and we can't have it in an infinity sense. So this means that the universe must have had a beginning. And so this is how this was argued using logic and mathematics to kind of argue this second premise. And like I said, this was kind of the premise that was kind of more argued in the past. So then another possible inconsistency with this argument was, okay, well, if we can't have a infinite past, then what about the idea of God being infinitely old? So if the universe can't have an infinite past, well, how can a God have an infinite past? But this is just a misunderstanding of what we mean by the classic idea of a Christian God or of God. So time and space are creations of God that began at the Big Bang. So then that means that before time, there's eternity, timelessness. Time doesn't exist. So God's not in that space of time. So God is here and then creates time, and then time begins. So in this space, God is eternal. So he didn't endure through an infinite amount of time up to creation. So he didn't have a bunch of infinite, events or things up to creation. So God is beyond time because God created the time. So that's how you can kind of think about it, is there's this point, the Big Bang, where now time is created and things are moving forward. And previous to that is eternal, and that's where God exists. So we don't really have to deal with the issue of God being infinitely old because he's not constrained by time. He's timeless outside of that. Okay, so if that's the first premise and this is the second premise, then what does that mean? So then, therefore, given that whatever begins to exist has a cause, and that the universe began to exist, there must be some sort of transcendent cause for the origin of the universe. So even atheist Kai Nielsen said, suppose you suddenly heard a loud bang, and you ask me, what made that bang? And I reply, nothing, it just happened. You would not accept that. And if a cause is needed for a small bang like that, then it's needed for the big bang as well. And this is the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation out of nothing, that there has to have been some transcendent cause for this universe to be, but it has to kind of come out of nothing. But what is that nothing? So let's talk about what qualities that this cause that would cause the universe have to be. So first, due to premise 1, it has to be uncaused. So the first premise says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So this cannot be caused. If the universe is going to have to be created, have a cause, then the thing that creates it, the thing that causes it, cannot itself be caused. So that means that whatever is that initial cause also has to be beginningless. So it has to be eternal. It cannot be caused, or then it doesn't meet the criterion. Okay. Also, it needs to be timeless, because like we said, if it is constrained by time, then we have the issue of infinite pasts. It needs to be spaceless, immaterial, a personal being, endowed with freedom of will, and empowered with enormous power. And so you might ask yourself, okay, immaterial, personal being, I'm not so sure about those. So I'm going to talk about those in the next couple of slides. Spaceless, because at the beginning of the universe, that's when all of that was created. So it has to be outside of that. Endowed with freedom of will. So it had to have the will to be able to create the universe. And then it has to have the power or the ability to create the universe. So it has to have a lot of power to be able to create everything. So you might say, okay, I can understand maybe some of those qualities, but why a personal being? So there are two reasons. There's the scientific and personal distinction, and then the non-physical or immaterial reality. So first, let me talk about what's the scientific and personal distinction. So there are two types of explanations. If I want to explain like what caused something, why something happened, I can either have a scientific or personal explanation. So scientific explanation would be to explain a phenomenon in terms of certain initial conditions and natural laws. We could explain how those initial conditions evolved to produce the phenomenon under consideration. A personal explanation explains things by means of an agent, and that agent's volition or will. So let me give you an example to help kind of clarify the difference between these two. So say you're just walking into the kitchen and there is water boiling in a kettle on the stove, like the picture here. So you might say, well, what's the explanation for this water boiling in this kettle? So you have two choices. There's a scientific or a personal explanation. Those are two just categories. So the scientific explanation would be, well, because the kinetic energy of the flame is conducted by the metal bottom of the kettle to the water, causing the water molecules to vibrate faster and faster until they're thrown off in the form of steam. So that's why our water is boiling. Or we can have a personal. The kettle is boiling because I wanted to make a cup of tea. Both are very legitimate explanations to this phenomenon. They just explain it in different ways. However, in regards to our explanation, we cannot have an explanation for the universe having a cause and that cause being scientific, because you cannot have a scientific explanation for the first state of the universe, because it cannot be explained by initial conditions. So this is the first state, okay? There's no earlier conditions, no natural laws leading up to it. When the universe was created, when it was caused, that's when they were developed. So that's when these initial conditions, these initial laws were created. So we can't use something that wasn't created yet to explain why something was caused, if that makes sense. It's kind of like putting the cart before the horse. We have to say what causes the universe, and in the creation of the universe, that's when these initial conditions, these natural laws occur. So if it can't be a scientific explanation, then it has to be a personal explanation. So this is why we need a personal being as the one of the attributes or qualities for that first cause, for the cause of the universe. Now, the second part, the non-physical or immaterial. So could it be a physical or material reality or a non-physical or immaterial reality? Now, remember, because the cause of the universe transcends time and space, so whatever caused the universe, this thing has to be outside of time and space, because when the universe is created, that's when time and space start. So it can't be a physical reality. It has to be a non-physical or immaterial reality, because it has to be outside or previous to when we have those natural laws and natural conditions. So if it has to then be a non-physical or immaterial reality, what are those types? There are only two types that could be timeless and immaterial. So these two types are abstract objects. So these could be like numbers, mathematical entities, but those can't cause anything to happen. We don't see, 5 causing a horse to exist or something. So mathematical entities and numbers, abstract objects of that sense, cannot cause anything to happen. A second type of non-physical or immaterial reality would be a mind. And so a mind can cause things to happen. So it kind of makes sense that the universe is the product of an unembodied mind that brought it into existence. And so if we look at all these qualities that I mentioned, God fits all of the requirements of that cause, of that initial cause. And so this was the argument that was used in defense of there being a creation, a God who created the universe, and that the universe didn't always exist. So I just thank you for coming to this talk, and just a short introduction on the explanation for the creation of the universe from a Christian standpoint. And before really science was able to really explain things. So a very old and ancient explanation. And here are some references for this argument that you are welcome to look at.